Welcome to this short video in the 5 Minutes of Supervision series. My name is Matthew Links. I'm the Discipline Lead in Medicine at Bond University and a medical oncologist. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Kombumerri people on the Gold Coast. And today I want to talk about understanding whether your learner lacks insight. When I talk to supervisors, this is one of the greatest difficulties that they list, the problem of lack of insight. And in this video, I want to talk about lack of insight, what it is, why it's important, how to diagnose it, and some approaches to dealing with it. Now, there are a wide variety of definitions of insight in the literature. Most commonly, I think people mean there's a gap between the learner's self-assessment and the external data. The problem with this is that all of us struggle with assessing our own performance, and even high-achieving learners are often too hard on themselves to be accurate. Sometimes insight is defined as a skill of making accurate self-evaluation, but the definition I find most helpful is of insight as a dynamic process of making accurate self-evaluations and then acting on them. Now, why this is important is because our role as supervisors is to help learners transition from a state where they're heavily dependent upon the feedback from others to guide their performance to where they are independent practitioners. When you're an independent practitioner, feedback is hard to get. Second point is that accurate assessment of performance is critical to safe practice. And the third issue is that lack of insight is a major barrier to remediation and improving poor performance. And this is often where the issue becomes a problem. Now, lack of insight can present in two main ways. The static presentation is when you ask a learner, how do you think you went? And your heart sinks and you realise they don't really understand how they've performed. You can represent this on a spider plot where you map scores in multiple domains of the self-assessment and the external assessment, and you can see the gap. This highlights how lack of insight can be global, or it can be restricted to a particular domain like communication. The second presentation is a dynamic one where performance has been poor and it fails to improve with repeated feedback. So understanding a differential diagnosis of this situation is a bit like a clinical reasoning task. You have to consider the evidence for all the possible explanations of this presentation. And the first possibility is that the assessment of the performance is wrong. We all know some people are hard markers, sort of hawks, and it can be difficult to get the standard right. It helps if the feedback is triangulated from multiple sources. So when in doubt, checking with a colleague is really helpful. The second possibility is they haven't really had those difficult conversations with them or haven't been told clearly enough. Now, to avoid hurting feelings, sometimes I feel like I soft pedal, and it's important to ask if the feedback's been clear. And sometimes the problem is the consequences haven't been laid out clearly enough. For example, you will fail a term if you're rude to the nurses. Students sometimes think that if they're smart and they perform their technical tasks, how they behave doesn't matter. We need to be clear about expectations. Now, it's not uncommon for learners not to be convinced by the feedback they're given. It's easy to write off a single bit of feedback. Consistent patterns from multiple people is hard to argue with. Now, if the problem's not followed up, it's hard for them to improve, and a failure to improve can also be the result of ineffective or poorly directed feedback. For example, just being advised to practice more where there are underlying organisational problems in terms of organising clinical tasks. Failure to diagnose and address underlying learning problems is a cause of failure to improve, but it's not lack of insight. We also need to be sure that the failure to improve hasn't been because of lack of support, emotional or practical. Now, failure of the learner to hear good quality feedback is a really wicked problem. Good advice comes from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Number 5, seek first to understand and then be understood. So let's understand why the trainee is not hearing. Is it a problem of credibility? A particular difficult example is where sexist assumptions get in the way of hearing feedback for women, or when feedback from non-medical staff is not valued. The learner's lack of experience in responding to criticism can be a problem. For many doctors, this may be the first time their performance has been criticised. Is there an emotional barrier to being criticised, a more generic problem with dealing with criticism? Or is there a values clash where they don't value teamwork or communication and therefore dismiss this criticism as unimportant? Beliefs about learning and performance may be a barrier. A fixed mindset is an example that works against hearing feedback, a belief you can't improve, it's all inherent. And it may be there's not the motivation to fix it. Self-sabotage is a thing, and amotivation is characteristic of burnout. This raises the broader issue of how mental health issues, depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder can get in the way of accurate self-improvement. Now, it's important to acknowledge that this is a stressful time for the trainee and understand the supports that are available for them and connect them to these supports. But it's also a very stressful thing for a supervisor to deal with. Distributing the responsibility helps in multiple ways. These are really difficult decisions and judgments, so getting support from senior colleagues helps. And it's also important to get the support you need for your own self-care. Well, having made a good diagnosis, there's now a chance to make a good treatment plan, and this almost always includes getting more data about the performance and about the underlying issues, barriers and enablers. Second, make sure all the supervisor and feedback variables are optimised, and this is taken out of the equation. Then, having understood the learner barriers, you can make a plan that specifically tries to address these. Documenting these conversations and an improvement performance plan is critical, and supporting wellbeing through the process is another critical step. And then the cycle goes on with evaluating how it's going and getting more data. So to summarise, lack of insight's a major problem. It really is best seen as a dynamic process, and the failure to respond to feedback is the red flag. Before diagnosing lack of insight, you need to address alternative explanations and ensure that clear, specific and effective feedback has been given with a real opportunity to improve. Understand the learner's barriers to hearing feedback and document and manage the stress for your trainee and yourself. Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation and have picked up some helpful tips for dealing with this difficult problem. If you are dealing with a trainee with lack of insight currently, I'd encourage you to reach out for advice and support. I hope you might find other lectures in this series helpful on YouTube or Vimeo, and I've provided some useful papers for further learning. If you found this helpful, please like it or leave a comment or suggestion for improvement, and requests for content are welcome. Good luck, and may your learners be insightful.